So I wanted to talk about a couple of pieces. This was often the sermon kind of comes together with there's this narrative arc and it kind of makes sense. One point kind of leads to the next. And this was not a Sunday where that happened. This is a sermon in two stories, perhaps. The story that really struck me was a story that I heard in the news yesterday. So it's a story about a college. Now, most all of you know that I attended California Lutheran University down in Thousand Oaks near Los Angeles. And here at Grace, we have people at Cal Lutheran, we have people at Gustavus Adolphus, we have people at St. Olaf, probably one of our better known colleges. We have about 25 colleges across the United States that are affiliated with the ELCA. There are a couple in Ohio. There's one in Springfield, Ohio, in fact. Now, I'm not saying that a story about Springfield, Ohio, and a lesson about tongues being a problem and the fires that light the world on fire, except that's exactly where we're going. If you have been following the news about the lies that have been told knowingly and with expectation that there might be harm done about people who are immigrants who live in Springfield, Ohio, you have probably heard as well that city offices, hospitals, schools have been closed and on lockdown because of violent threats made against those facilities. People who have not lied, but who have knowingly lied, with a reasonable expectation that harm might come from it. There's a word in the church that we use for behavior like this. It's called sin. It is a sin. Wittenberg University has canceled all of their programming over the weekend due to threats to the campus and student body. Most likely, the students are unable to gather for worship today, which would be a hallmark of what it means to be a college affiliated with the ELCA. Because people have knowingly lied with a reasonable expectation that there might be harm done as a result of it. It is a sin. In the United States, we have a lot of lofty ideals about who we strive to be. I would argue they are among some of the greatest in the whole world. But we also, for anybody who has taken any class in U.S. history, know that there have frequently over the generations been chapters where we have fallen short of those ideals, where tongues have caused fires to blaze all over the place. It's not too many generations ago where signs would have been plastered in various places that said, Irish need not apply, right? That is something that you would see in the United States. For those of us who have lived in the United States for generations, particularly if we grew up in the Lutheran Church, particularly if we are German in background, know that in the early 1900s, over against World War I, that Germans were seen as suspect. The language disappeared and was no longer taught in schools. People were careful when they went out in public. There are some things when we get the text for the Sunday that is assigned and it lands on the news of the day in a way that is difficult to separate. But I think when we think of the eighth commandment and we think of it over and against this text from James, that is our greatest challenge as a human people. It's hard Because there are days when we get most of the way through the day and we're hungry and we're tired or we're hangry, and that person that requires us to be on our best game to be polite shows up, and we say something that we regret, and we go home and go, "Oh, I didn't mean to say that." But at times we live in an environment, political and otherwise, where we have been convinced that someone else is a bad person, such that if they do a bad thing, I don't really need proof because we all know they're bad people. Again, as good Lutheran Christians, we would say there are not good people and bad people. The planet is covered with people. Some of them we run into on our best days, and some of them we don't. Some days we run into folks that we struggle with. Some days we are the folks that others struggle with. But on all of those days, Luther calls us to work hard to be our best. In fact, the text in the Small Catechism says that we are called to put the kindest construction on our neighbor's actions and words. Now, we might hear the question from the gospel, well, but who is my neighbor, right? And then we get the story of the Good Samaritan. Neighbor is broad. Neighbor is broad. Scene. Moving to the second part of the sermon. The gospel text for today is a key text, and we are back to the Gospel of Mark, so that means it's short and sweet and to the point, and it moves along. This is where Peter gets it right, which is not always the way Peter works, but this time he did get it right. And so Peter shows up. Jesus is asking the disciples, what are people saying about me? It's kind of, what's the polling out there? It's kind of that kind of a scenario. And then Jesus makes it more pointed. But who do you say that I am? Not other people. Who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you are the Messiah, period. Now, we might think Messiah equals Jesus, but sometimes we don't really understand how to get our arms around that term. In Jesus' day, the Messiah was a very defined thing. When you said Messiah, people knew exactly what that was. In American history, perhaps a George Washington kind of figure if he was also a priest. That would be kind of the Messiah. And so there were expectations. This is going to be a heroic era. This is going to be a clash of arms, and the Romans are going to be cast out, and there is going to be a new reign under God, under the Messiah, a blessing to the world. It's a specific thing. You can picture that Peter has gone off into daydream land of this amazing thing and how he'll be right at Jesus' right hand, and it's going to be fabulous. And when he snaps back to it, he hears Jesus talking about what being the Messiah will actually mean. Pain, difficulty, having the scribes and the Pharisees and the priests all against us. Eventually death on a cross and then resurrection. And Peter is thinking, this doesn't sound anywhere near as fun as I was imagining. What's curious is the physical cues here. He turns Jesus away from the people so that he has him to himself and says, this is not a good idea. In fact, the verb used is rebuke. It's a very strong word, particularly from a student to the rabbi. That's not your role to rebuke the rabbi. Jesus then turns away from Peter back to the other disciples and rebukes Peter. Get behind me, Satan. It's difficult to find harder words in the gospel text. It's a really harsh phrase. This rebuke business, The verb is also used in Mark when Jesus is casting out demons, unclean spirit, rebuke. The storm on the sea is rebuked. This is a very strong term. When we look at what happens after this, though, Jesus turns to the crowd and says, "You will need to take up your cross and follow me." And we have, I think we all know, lost the shock and horror of the cross. It has become something we wear around our necks. It is not the horrible tool of execution that it was in Jesus' day. And people saying, wait a minute, to follow you requires bearing a cross? This is a phrase we still use in English, although it's kind of fading. We might say, oh, well, but that's my cross to bear. Often it's in reference to an arthritic knee or something like that, and that's not exactly what we're getting at here. It is the price that is paid for being a follower of Christ. The price that is paid. Is it the person in a social group, in a family group perhaps, who is saying, what you're saying about those people is untrue? You need to stop that. Does following Christ put us on good terms with everyone we pass by? Is it the easy path? Is it helping people when we like them and they happen to stumble across our path? Or is it helping people by going out of our way to people that we might not ordinarily choose to be with to help? Does it mean sacrificing time on our schedule to be in this place, to worship God? There is a long list of things that we might think of as we think, what does it mean to follow Christ? And that there is a cost to be paid in that. So I would encourage you, I guess, with these two parts of the sermon kind of going together in a way, that following Christ is not like going down a slide. It is a challenge and difficult and has a cost. And that particularly in the next couple of months, as we move towards an election, that we're mindful of the tongue that can set the forest ablaze, that we are mindful about how we speak about others, and perhaps the opportunity that we have to challenge the speech of others. Amen.